We are about a week away from Season 2 release. They seem to have slowed down on balance patches. We likely won't see any reworks or functionalities of spells change anymore. We might see some additional tuning for raid, but apart from that, class balancing seems mostly done. So I think it's time to make a tier list. I will talk a bit about my terminology first. I think S tier and I think other tier list makers aren't following this. I think S tier should denote that a class is mandatory in every key, absolutely broken. I think in Season 1, Enhanced and Shaman fit that criteria. I think right now, not many classes fit this criteria, if any at all. I think for the A tier, an A tier spec would be capable of world first keys, but not absolutely required, so there's a bit of flexibility there. And I have added an extra A minus tier to denote a spec that is strong, but maybe not taken at that level, but is still capable. I think B tier specs are completely performant. They can do completely fine damage, but they get overshadowed by other specs of the same class or role. And I think C tier specs are out there doing low damage or having like some big issues. And then D tier specs I think are incredibly flawed and have massive issues. So first, I will be putting Augmentation Evoker in S tier. Now, there is a lot of conflict about this. A lot of people seem to be of the opinion that Augmentation Evoker damage is not good enough to time the highest keys, and Augmentation Evoker damage is not looking good right now. Typically, Augmentation Evoker damage is not good, although right now it probably is seeming to be one of the worst seasons for Aug damage that it's ever been. Historically, this hasn't mattered. Augmentation Evoker has been OP meta in every season since it came out. In Dragonflight Season 3, it did do low damage. It was actually faster to play 3 DPS in Dragonflight Season 3 in most dungeons, at least before the 4 DPS strat came out. It was actually faster in that to do that in most dungeons. However, it was a lot more dangerous and ended up being really risky, like high chance of depleting your key. The synergies weren't really there in that season. So typically Aug was played a lot by the highest caliber players. It could be different in this season. They have nerfed Aug's utility a lot since then, but I don't really think it matters. I don't think they've nerfed the utility enough. They did nerf the tank and healer buff. However, I think that was already been nerfed over the years, so it was kind of minor. And they still do buff the healer through Source of Magic, Blistering Scales, Spatial Paradox. And they do have a lot of utility, not only in the Evoker class tree, but also in the Augmentation spec tree, which has a lot of utility for some reason. A lot of stops, a lot of defensive utility. Everything has a shorter cooldown because of interwoven threads. I think Augmentation Evoker is still going to be S tier if history is anything to go by. I definitely think it is probably at the weakest it has ever been, and is probably acceptable to not run it in a lot of comps potentially. However, I still think it's kind of coping to think Augmentation Evoker is not going to be good. The next spec I have is Devastation Evoker, which I think is not good. I think Devastation Evoker damage is again a bit left behind. Not really a great damage profile. Not really doing much damage. It does have the Evoker utility, but it is on a longer cooldown for Dev for some reason, and is missing all the Aug exclusive utility. I don't think Dev is going to be good for another season. Now in A tier, I think that is the conclusion of the S tier. In A tier, I have Beast Mastery Hunter as the first spec. I do think Beast Mastery Hunter is probably the highest damage spec in the game right now. Does a lot of AoE, it has consistent damage and burst. Does good single target. It doesn't do any spectacular prio, but it does do something to the prio mob. The only real caveat is that it's a hunter, kind of low utility, no buff. I do think it is the highest damage spec, but I don't think it's by a massive margin. I don't necessarily think it's OP. To do other hunter specs, I think Survival Hunter is kind of just in B tier. I think Survival Hunter can do some damage. Its damage isn't bad, but it's definitely going to be overshadowed by BM in current balance. and it is melee. It's a bit of a minus, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad spec. And then for the last hunter spec, I think Marksman Hunter is very, very flawed. The rework came. I don't really think the rework did much. It definitely missed the mark. They slowed down the spec. Your casts are longer. They didn't really give it anything. The damage is not there. Your damage is like very tied to lock and load procs as well, and they massively reduce the proc rate of those. And then you still cannot hit 2 targets as a Marksman Hunter for some reason. Trick Shot still has the restriction of hitting 3 targets to activate it, and Aimed Shot is still target capped from Trick Shots. I think there's just a lot of flaws with Marksmanship Hunter that make it not really viable to do keys with on a high level when pools start getting big or pools start getting small. It's all bad for Marksmanship Hunter, I think. The next class I have in A tier, I have Mage. Fire Mage, I think, is definitely one of the best specs. Doing good single target, doing good priority damage, doing good AoE. I believe they play a mix of an Ignite and Flame Strike build. And it is a Mage. Of course, you have the Mage survivability and the Mage utility. Things like Mass Barrier, high mobility. No real downsides to Mage. And also Int is a strong buff. But I don't think it's doing overpowered amounts of damage. I don't think anything is crazy here. But Mage is definitely looking good, and it's looking like Fire Mage. I think Frost Mage is alright. Frost Mage is kind of doing pretty close damage to Fire Mage, but I think just historically, I think it's a pretty safe bet to say that Fire Mage is going to be the better spec, and then Frost Mage is going to be slightly worse. If you're a Frost main, it's probably fine to play Frost, for example. And then of course, Fire has Court, well, Frost has Cold Snap. I think Court is typically better. Then Arcane, I think, as always for Mage specs, Arcane, it has fallen behind a bit in Mythic Plus. It is pretty much standard in Mythic Plus. Fire greater than Frost, greater than Arcane in most seasons. And I think this is no exception. I think the damage for Arcane is just like not so much there as the other specs. Now for Shaman. Well, actually, no. Now for Warlock. I think Warlock is looking quite good. Destruction Warlock. They did get recently nerfed. I believe it was like a 5% nerf or something. It was like a bug fix to Channel Demon Heartfire passive procs. But they did get recently nerfed. I do put Warlock here because Warlock is doing the most DPS in massive uncapped pools. Like, you pull like 20 mobs, Warlocks can go upwards of 50 mil DPS. Like First Will Workshop, First Will Motherload, First Will Cinderbrew. Warlocks are definitely doing the most damage in that situation. However, it is only that situation that they're doing anything spectacular. Outside of that situation, I think they simply do the normal damage of normal specs. This is not unprecedented. Warlock has always done massive uncapped AoE. In Season 4 Dragonflight, there was always a big hype around Destruction Warlock doing massive AoE in PTR, which didn't come through on live because it was kind of just killing the Shadow Priest funnel, and it was like kind of just padding AoE on one big pool with Lust that was going to die fast anyways. So it's not really conclusive to tell if Warlock's like super good or not. I think it's really good on certain big pools, but other than that, I don't think that's actually that relevant to timing the key. But I do think it is one of those best specs right now. And then the other Warlock specs I think are actually quite good. But I shall put them in B tier. I think the other Warlock specs are Demonology and Affliction. They are both actually capable of doing good damage. I do think they both get overshadowed by Destro, though. I could be wrong on this. I have seen these Warlock specs do good damage, but I do think if you're playing a Warlock, I think Destro is a spec right now. Now we look at Shaman. Enhancement Shaman. Now, this has been nerfed a lot. Every week there's a new Enhancement Shaman nerf, but I swear it's still good. I mean, I have done a lot of Enhancement Shaman testing. I've played in a lot of groups. I swear Enhancement Shaman is still good. You have big AoE in a totemic build, big single target in a Stormbringer build, and even in totemic you do good single target. I think there's a lot of flexibility in the Enhanced Shaman talent tree. I think you can play many different playstyles. You can play both hero talents. I definitely think the damage of Enhanced Shaman is still there. I don't think it's like an overall monster. It's definitely going to be worse than these specs. There are definitely specs that will beat Enhanced Shaman in overall. And it's not like Enhanced Shaman is doing crazy prio. Like the prio damage from Enhanced Shaman is not like as crazy as it has been in the past. But I really do think Enhanced Shaman is still good. The utility is a bit less than last season. There's no more poisons or curse spells or fears. AG got removed, but I mean, Sky Fury is good, the stops are good, and I really think the damage is also good. I think Enhanced Shaman is there. I think Elemental Shaman is also very similar. I think in damage. I do think that Elemental Shaman is a bit like less flexible though. I think that's why I place Enhancement over Elemental. I think Elemental is a bit less flexible. But I think all the same points I made for Enhancement still stand. Alright, and then I think the next spec is Druid DPS. And I actually think Feral is looking better than Boomy right now. So Feral is doing a lot of damage. It is doing it also as priority damage, like Feral is hitting off one target, which is cleaving the rest of the pack. I think that is a pretty good edge over Boomy. I think Feral is looking very good right now. A lot of people think this is controversial, but Feral is actually doing damage. A lot of people are playing it right now. They're seeing it do damage, and also it is a Druid spec, bringing Mark of the Wild. And I actually looked back recently. I actually looked back into every season since Mark of the Wild came out. I believe in Dragonflight. Every single season, a Druid spec has been meta in the highest keys. Every single season. Even including Dragonflight Season 1, almost every key is done with either a Resto Druid or a Balanced Druid. So I think Mark of the Wild is probably the best buff right now. I think Druid is looking good. And on that note, I also put Boomy there for same reasoning. I think Boomy is doing massive AoE, has Mark of the Wild. I think Boomy cooldown, since the rework 100-second 2 charges, is very flexible. They can pretty much cooldown anything they want to cooldown. The only caveat for Boomy, I think, is that they do not do good single target and they do not do good prio damage. So I think if you're playing between Feral and Boomy, the advantage of Boomy is that it's range, it has flexible cooldowns, and maybe does a bit more AoE. Whereas Feral does more single target prio damage, but its cooldowns are a lot less flexible and it doesn't do so much outside of its cooldowns. Next, I think, is Rogue, and I think Subtlety Rogue and Assassination Rogue are both in this spot. Subtlety Rogue is simply doing a lot of damage. There is nothing like really beyond that. I think it's got like very strong bursts in minute 30 cooldowns, but it also has like strong mini bursts outside of those cooldowns. I don't really have much to say about Rogue apart from the fact that it is just simply doing good damage. Obviously, it doesn't have a buff, but it is quite tanky class. And it does have a group DR. So I think there is value in Rogue, and I think Rogue is reasonably strong in terms of damage. Assassination Rogue recently got a tier set buff. I think its damage is looking very good. But I think the one caveat of Sub Rogue, kind of bound by cooldowns, the one caveat of Assassination Rogue is that its single target, pure single target, is a bit low. Its priority damage is good. Now, I think the last spec that, actually, I should talk about Outlaw Rogue as well. Outlaw Rogue is definitely not looking good. Outlaw Rogue is still fucking target capped. It is very flawed. It can only hit 8 targets. You take this to dungeon with big pools. You take this to like a Priori or a Cinderbrew or something. It's going to be doing tank damage. Its damage, apart from that, is not even spectacular. On like mid-target counts, you take it to like a 5-target pack. It's not even doing that good damage. It's maybe doing alright damage, maybe passable. But how can you justify it playing a spec that sandbags on big pools just to do mediocre damage on medium pools? single target, whatever. Nothing is special about Outlaw. This spec is simply flawed. Arms Warrior is the next spec I wanted to look at. This is actually a really, really, really good damage spec. Arms Warrior damage is actually looking really good. And this is kind of crazy to think about. A lot of the times Warrior has been trash in Mythic Plus, but I swear things are changing. There are a lot of viable attack power users, like Beast Mastery Hunter, Enhancement Shaman, Feral Druid, and Rogues. Like, these are all big attack power users. There is very much potential for the Battle Shout buff, which is still 5%, while other buffs have been nerfed to 3%. I don't think Warrior utility is so bad anymore, although it is still quite mediocre. But I think the Warrior damage, Arms Warrior, is actually good. I do think it does kind of low priority damage. But I think the one issue with Arms Warrior right now is that it is looking very, very good in Raid. And that is kind of scary because it means it probably will get a nerf. So as it is, I think Arms is probably at the bottom of A tier. And I think it's potentially gonna get taken down for that. I don't know. In terms of Fury Warrior, I'm pretty sure Fury Warrior is also doing good damage, but it's not doing the spectacular amounts of damage that Arms is. And because of that, I place it in B. Mainly because it's a Warrior spec, and Warrior specs are typically not that great. But I do think Arms Warrior is doing the damage to make up for it at the moment. That concludes my DPS for A tier, but I still have A minus tier, which I do consider the specs in A minus tier to be competitive with the specs in A tier. So I think here we have Ret Paladin. Now, Ret Paladin I think is stronger than last tier. I think the tier set is good. They got some buffs. Divine Hammers is a nice little buff. They are doing quite strong AoE damage. I think they are definitely capable of doing AoE damage compared to the top classes. The single target is not bad. A lot of people always say, like, oh, Ret has bad single target in the M plus build. That's not really true anymore. I feel like Ret's single target seems absolutely fine. And then the only issue is like the priority damage. Obviously, Ret priority damage is never really good. However, it is definitely better than it has been in previous seasons. I think without a doubt, Ret is better than it was in Season 1. Now, the big issue Ret had in Season 1 was Protection Paladin was the overpowered tank. And Retribution Paladin was overlapping a lot of its utility with Prop Paladin. I think that is kind of solved right now. I don't really think that's so much of an issue. I think there are other good tanks. Vengeance DH is looking good. Protection Paladin might be the best tank, but I think it's viable to play other tanks. So I think Ret Paladin is looking a lot better than it was last season. However, I still think it is a bit behind these specs. I think it's doing a little bit less damage in certain situations, and it doesn't have a group buff behind these specs, I think. But I think it is a good spec. Windwalker Monk. Now, Windwalker Monk is a bit of a controversial spec. People don't really know if it's good or bad. I definitely don't think it's doing the damage of these soft specs. I don't think it's doing the damage. I think it's a bit behind in terms of damage. But it does do good damage. A lot of people say something about Windwalker having a target cap. It doesn't really have a target cap. It's kind of reduced after 5 on pretty much all of its abilities, which is pretty much the same as like Shaman was in Season 1. So that's not so much a concern. But I do think the damage is like a notch lower than the top specs. I think there is a lot of validity in Monk utility, and I think the physical buff is actually quite good now. Many like specs that do physical damage probably going to be played. So I think there is actually a good amount of merit in Windwalker Monk, and I think the damage is there for it to be playable. My next spec is Shadow Priest. Now, a lot of people think Shadow Priest is going to be good. A lot of people are scared of like another God comp or something. I think Shadow Priest damage is behind. Like, Shadow Priest AoE damage is definitely behind. I think its priority damage is fine. Its single target is fine, but its AoE damage is definitely behind. It's not going to be pumping on overall. I think Shadow Priest is like looking a bit sus in terms of actually being like a super meta. That being said, I think it's good. I think the damage is fine. It's a similar situation to Windwalker. I think it can do damage. I just don't think it's doing the top level of damage. It is bringing PI, which is nice. I think one issue with Shadow Priest is that Disc Priest is probably looking like the best healer again. Although Mistweaver is looking good enough to play, I think Shadow Priest is not looking to be like the choice for the Priest buff or anything. And I do think Shadow Priest relies a lot on Aug. A lot of people saying Aug might not get played. That would not be good for Shadow Priest if that was the case. I definitely think Shadow Priest has potential, but it's nowhere near a level of God Comp level of status. Could be a good spec, could be playable, but I don't think it's like anything crazy. Next, I have Frost DK. Now, Frost DK, I think, is pretty much in the same spot as it is in the current season. It's doing damage in the current season in Season 1, but it's not the top damage. And as you can see, in for example, in TGP, most teams opted to get rid of Frost DK. Boomy was simply just doing more damage. Frost DK was kind of just like a bit of a crutch for being more survivable. And I think it's going to be the same in Season 2. Frost DK is going to do a little bit less damage than the top classes, but it has no buff, but it is going to be quite survivable. Very, very strong survivability makes it easier to do keys if you don't need to worry about someone living. And I think in the same vein, Unholy DK is probably going to be, again, worse than Frost as it was in Season 1. Still has the benefit of being quite survivable, but I think it's going to be worse than Frost. Not so good on like lower target counts or something. Something to that effect. Not having the same flexibility that Frost DK had. And I will change the ordering of these specs a bit. I think this is probably the ordering of these specs in B. And then the last DPS. The last DPS is Havoc Demon Hunter. Now, Havoc Demon Hunter is a very, very special case, and I shall add a new row for this. And I think Havoc Demon Hunter is bugged. Wounded Quarry is doing about triple the damage it should. Roughly triple. It's like double dipping, triple dipping. It's getting way too many amplifications than it should. Now, Wounded Quarry is a spell that causes your main target to take 20% of the damage you deal to other targets as chaos damage, which is then buffed multiple times by your chaos damage amplifiers. Now, its overall isn't crazy. Havoc DH is not doing any crazy overalls. But the one thing that it is doing is it is doing insane priority target damage. So when you pull about like 10 to 20 targets into a boss or like a big mob, the Havoc DH will absolutely destroy that boss or mob. I was doing a rookery as a Havoc DH. I would hit for 30 mil every few seconds on the priority mob in the last split. I did a Dark Flame Cleft on the first boss, which has a lot of like small mobs around it. I was actually doing 4.5 mil single target DPS to the boss, where you kill the boss a solid minute faster than any other group would. If Havoc DH remains in this way, it will be S tier. It will define the meta. You'll be pulling onto every boss, etc. However, I believe it's definitely getting nerfed. It's very clearly bugged to an egregious amount. I have heard that Blizzard might have already said they're gonna fix it. I'm not entirely sure on that one. But if this gets fixed, I think it's not going to be S tier. If bugged, if not fixed, S. If fixed, maybe A minus. I think this is the state for Havoc Demon Hunter. It was looking alright before this buff. It was actually doing pretty good damage before this buff. But ever since this buff came out, it is like really, really horrendously OP in certain scenarios, such that it would define the meta. But I think if it was to get fixed, I think it would be down here with these specs, maybe a little bit less damage than the top specs, but still doing enough to be viable. So that is it for DPS. I will go on to healers now. I think the best healer is Disc Priest, and I think this is a very common sentiment, the best healer being Disc Priest. They did rework the spec, kind of plays quite similarly, but I think it just has a bit more freedom to do things. Still has Power Word Shield, Obviously still a priest, still has fort, still has mind soothe, still has PI. PI is still looking pretty good in this season, maybe a bit less than season 1. I guess priest does fall off a little bit if you're not playing a Proc Pally or an Aug Evoker. A lot of people think you might not be playing those. I'm not entirely sure about that. But it definitely is still looking like Dispriest is doing the most healing, the most damage, and providing strong utility. However, I do think Mistweaver is a bit of a new contender to this. I think Mistweaver healing is good. Mistweaver damage is definitely the same as Dispriest. They do actually bring a quite a relevant buff. They did buff Mistweaver in this patch so that they have more single target damage and healing. I think Mistweaver is going to be strong, but I think it does have caveats that Dispriest doesn't. It doesn't have as many power to survive one-shots, which there are some of in the season, but not in every dungeon. And it does have a bit of a struggle if it's forced to leave melee for too long. Because of a lot of Mistweaver's healing is pretty much the same as Dispriest healing, as in it's like an atonement style healing. I think Restoration Druid is a B tier healer. I think they can do some healing. They can do some damage. They're definitely doing less damage than Mistweaver and Dispriest. They do have Mark of the Wild, which is quite strong. But I definitely think Restoration Druid is looking to be behind these healers again. Nothing really special there. It's still ahead of the other healers. Now, the other healers, I think Holy Priest. I think Holy Priest is a C tier healer. I really don't think Holy Priest is good at healing, AoE healing specifically. I think if Holy Priest was good at AoE healing, it'd probably be up a bit more. But because Priest is good, like this Priest is good. A Holy Priest has most of the Priest utility. It doesn't have shields, but it does have like PI and Fort. But I think the healing for Holy Priest is simply just not really there in AoE healing situations. I think Preservation Evoker is C tier. I don't think it's doing spectacular damage. I don't think it's doing spectacular healing, but it's not doing bad damage or bad healing, I think. It does have Evoker utility, but it's attached to a healer, so it's less relevant. I do think it is like probably playable, but it's definitely not going to be good. And I am a lot more harsh on healers than I am on DPS. I think it is maybe a bit restricted to play Preservoker as it typically is. I don't think there's anything special going to be coming out of Preservoker. And then Resto Shaman, I think Resto Shaman can do healing. It has a buff, but it does no damage. Resto Shaman is the most ZDPS spec. It does absolutely nothing. I'm pretty sure you could spec that. You could buff that spec's damage by 100% in a patch, and it might not even be enough to be the top. And also it has the issue of having to drink every pull. I do think it's like healing is probably okay apart from the mana issue. But I definitely think Resto Shaman is not a good healer. And then my next healer, Holy Paladin. I honestly have not seen anyone play this spec, really. Not seen many people talk about it. I mean, I've seen a lot of people talk about it, rather, in a negative way. Not seen many people play it. I've seen a few people play it, but I really think Holy Paladin is a bad spec right now. Like they have like steady nerfed Holy Paladin for so many times that it's just ended up being pretty much useless. Quite sad. But I don't know. Hopefully it's probably just like a bit of a number issue. If they could like maybe buff it a bit more, it might be fine. I'm not really sure. I definitely think Holy Paladin is not my area of expertise right now. I will admit. Now we look at tanks. Tanks, I think we have 2 tanks in A tier. Now Vengeance DH is allegedly the most survivable tank, doing the most damage, from what I've heard. I don't know exactly how true it is, but I definitely think it is quite up there. Now, typically in a season, the best tank is the tank that can survive the most and can do the most damage. That is very typical. And right now that is looking like Vengeance CH. Vengeance CH has like reasonable utility with things like Silent Sigil. Nothing spectacular, of course, since they removed double sigil. Magic debuff is nice, but it's not like insane anymore since it's 3%. But I definitely think Vengeance DH is looking quite good. Prot Paladin is also looking good. They did nerf the spec, so it's definitely not as good as Season 1. No, they nerfed its damage and healing, survivability rather. It still has the utility though. It still has the Avenger Shield, still has sack. I am concerned it does get to this point where Protection Paladin is again the best tank because of its utility. I mean, it's the best tank and it's overpowered because of its utility. I am concerned it gets to this point again. Hopefully not. I definitely think it's not as required if other tanks are actually on the level in survivability and healing that they were not in Season 1. Now the other tanks, I actually think Brewmaster is looking pretty decent. I will put it in B though. It is looking pretty decent. I mean, as always though, Brewmaster kind of, as the keys get higher, kind of gets harder. Low utility, can't really do much for the group. Has a decent buff in certain comps. I don't think there's anything noteworthy, but it is better than in the current season, I want to say. Protection Warrior, I have heard Protection Warrior is doing some good damage. Again, a good buff for certain comps. I'm pretty sure it can live some things. I don't have much to say about it. I don't think it's doing anything spectacular compared to these tanks though. And then Blood DK, I think is doing good damage, doing good survivability again. I do think Blood DK is just not doing anything spectacular, has no buff. Has some utility, although I don't think grips are so useful this season. Grips are definitely a lot more useful last season. And then the last tank, Guardian Druid, I'm still going to put this in B, but is definitely looking to be the worst tank. Apparently it is quite survivable, but its damage is very low. But I do think it is worst tank, but I will put it in B. And this is my tier list. This is my final tier list. I think balance is quite good. There are a lot of specs in A, and even the specs in A minus I consider part of A. I don't even know. I think Aug is definitely the weakest it's been, and I'll be very happy if it turns out to not be an Aug meta. But yeah, I mean, I think class balance is good. A lot of classes that I actually think are doing like very, very similar damage, and I don't think there are any like gross synergies that cause one class to be elevated over the others, like there was in previous seasons. I think there's a lot of classes in B that are also like pretty decent, and honestly probably just one buff away from being like very top tier. And then I think there's only a handful of specs that are actually like flawed and doing low damage. In terms of healers, healer balance is definitely not looking good. Definitely looking like a disc and mist over season, and with an emphasis on the disc. And tank balance is actually looking alright, but I think it's just kind of gravitating towards Vengeance DH and Protection Paladin. But tank balance is probably looking better than it has in the past. This is my final tier list for now. Assuming they don't do any major balance patch, I think it will stay this way unless they do any like nerfs. Maybe a few specs will go down, maybe a few specs will go up for like raid tuning. Now a lot of people have asked me about a meta comp. I don't think there will be a meta comp right now. A lot of people will always say that there will always be a meta. I think that is false. We have several seasons where there are flex spots in the meta, where people can't quite decide what to play. And even the current season, there is one flex spot in terms of DPS. We look back at Dragonflight Season 1, that was a triple flex DPS. You had groups timing top keys with one comp of 3 DPS, and then your groups going into keys with 3 completely different DPS classes, and then timing the same key in the same time. It was a very impressive season. I definitely think we're kind of going back to that level right now. It's definitely looking very good right now. And I hope they don't like do any major reworks in 11.1.5. That is a major reason of why the class balance in Season 1 War Within was so bad, because of the Enhancement Shaman, Prot Paladin rework in 11.1.5. I do have concerns about this. Hopefully they keep their eyes on class balance and try to keep it good. And the one last thing I want to say is that you might for the top keys, you might have some kind of like mingling with buffs, raid buffs. We have Int and Chaos Brand mostly affecting casters, whereas we have Mystic Touch and Ballast Shout mostly affecting melee and BM Hunter. And the classes that provide these buffs all looking pretty good in multiple specs. Sky Fury and Mark of the Wild, Omni buffs, like they affect everyone. They are very strong. Pretty much every season has like these Omni buff classes used, so that might be a consideration. I think there might be situations where you're playing, say, a Feral Druid in a comp with a VDH and a Mage. You're kind of losing 6% for not playing balance, so maybe there's like considerations like that. Or even vice versa, you're playing a balanced Druid in a comp with a Mistweaver and a Arms Warrior. You're losing 10% for not playing Feral Druid. So there might be considerations like that. I definitely think the class balance is looking very good. I think I'm really hopeful for this season. I am really hopeful for this season. Thank you for watching.